So Dwayne, recently you made a pretty cool post on Instagram about bodybuilding, PEDs, and the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Can we dive into this a bit?
Yeah, it's a real problem that the RAS systems are a real problem in bodybuilding, especially in PED users, because the anabolics, especially obviously like testosterone and the other um, uh, medicines that they're using in the sport, they inherently turn on sympathetic nerve activity through hypothalamic control, and then drive RAS, despite even having any issues with hydration or anything. So we see water retention from the sodium holding and everything else happening, regardless of where we're at in our hydration. So it's really in bodybuilding, the biggest problem with the RAS system is we got heavy training coupled with generally a high salt diet now because everybody's promoting a lot of sodium intake. But then we have salt sensitivity because of the drugs that are being used to promote anabolism. And so we end up firing this RAS system up. And then this ends up becoming hypertensive issues with kidney function. And then we end up with kidney damage because we've got this high protein diet in the face of this system that's being turned on chronically that's supposed to be for regulating hydration and blood pressure homeostasis.
Is this something that typically gets worse over time, especially with bodybuilders who are trying to advance in their fields?
Yes, but it's multifactorial in bodybuilding because not only are we affecting the kidney function and everything else with the practices and the that we take on, but we're also affecting the cardiovascular system, which obviously the kidneys are big in regulating blood pressure homeostasis. So we end up with massive body mass, and yet the organs. So if you're a 300-pound guy at sub 15% body fat, which a lot of guys are in the pro open class, and we've got these drugs on board that are going to be driving systems that are going to increase blood pressure, increase sodium retention, and we also have this the heavy training and everything that's involved in major caloric intake. Your organs have to deal with a lot of things at one time that are contrary to blood pressure regulation and electrolyte homeostasis. So in bodybuilding, we see a big issue with kidney function and a big issue with cardiovascular function, heart function mainly, through the training methods and everything else that are involved.
I feel like the kidney function conversation is less or so talked about, because when I came across that on your page, I was like, oh, we kind of want to dig into this, because more so we see people talking about things like, cardiovascular issues, maybe like stroke, heart attack, pulmonary embolism, things like that. Yeah. So I like what you were saying about that. So I was thinking it was interesting because when you made the post, you talking about the kidneys, I never really thought about bodybuilding, PEDs, and like the kidneys, but we know how closely related the cardiovascular system and the renal system are engaged with one another, especially with blood pressure regulation. Because we always hear things like, eccentric hypertrophy and potentially heart attacks, pulmonary embolism, and stroke, dealing with the cardiovascular system. Is kidney damage just as, or even potentially another huge risk factor in congruence with the cardiovascular issues which come with bodybuilding?
Absolutely. Actually, so it's kind of funny because I work with a lot of pro bodybuilders. I see their labs all the time. And I'm kind of the guy that ends up having to fix a lot of problems. I don't get the accolades for getting them on the stage, except for the fact that they actually survive and make it to the stage. So, in bodybuilding, it's funny because left ventricular hypertrophy actually isn't as common as kidney damage from what I've seen. Where you think it would be with all the Valsalva maneuvers and everything they do, with the heavy squatting and deadlifting and everything else. But no, generally speaking, and this is my hypothesis, and it's probably pretty correct, is that when we have kidney damage, you generally don't know that your kidneys are damaged until you are tasting urea, like you can taste ammonia. Like that was my first sign when my kidneys started to fail. And when you get to that point, you now have issues with potassium regulation, or most people do have issues with potassium regulation. And so when we talk about kidney function and cardiovascular system, the blood pressure increases that we see with increased body mass, PEDs on board, high sympathetic tone, these types of things, they then drive renal dysfunction. And that's generally precedes cardiovascular collapse. And so when we start to see things like potassium rising in the blood, it's usually due to the fact that our kidneys aren't getting rid of potassium in an efficient way. This is where I think we're seeing a lot of young bodybuilders die. I think what's happening is they're getting hyperkalemia, so high blood potassium. It's going up to like 6, 7, millimolar, and then the heart stops, and then they say, oh, they had a heart attack, but they didn't have any signs of cardiovascular disease. And it's like, no, because they probably wasn't due to cardiovascular disease. It was due to the blood pressure driving kidney dysfunction that then drives hyperkalemia, high blood potassium, that then basically euthanizes you, because it's just like getting a shot of potassium chloride, like you would if you were going to the electric chair, or if you were going to death row. And people don't ask questions about these things because bodybuilders inherently have had these cardiovascular issues. So once the kidneys start to go, blood pressure regulation goes out the door. And then if blood pressure regulation goes out the door, the kidneys get worse. That's why we call it a runaway train. And then when we start to see potassium levels rise and you aren't caring for it, still eating all the same foods and everything else, then your risk of a heart attack are very high. Other issue is, talking about the RAS system in there, is that with anabolics on board, without anything else, we're already going to be activating RAS. And the problem is that now we start retaining salt and everything else, as well as high estrogen levels or dysregulated hormone levels can cause salt sensitivity. Then blood pressure rises because of that, right? And then we end up with this, hypervolemic state where we have like a lot of blood volume on board. We like that for the pump, right? And then this drives kidney dysfunction even further. So on top of that, then now guys are saying, okay, well, let's shut down RAS using telmisartan. And I actually just did a post on this. When we start shutting down RAS using telmisartan, and we're just doing it because we're buying telmisartan, on the black market, which is an angiotensin receptor blocker, right? That ends up inherently also retaining potassium. And so we end up with a potassium sparing effect. And if our kidneys aren't functioning well, and that's going to be a function of our blood pressure homeostasis, then now we can run risk of having this hyperkalemic state or high potassium state in a condition where people actually don't even know they have it, because they're taking this drug and don't even know they're raising potassium levels by it. So it's a multifactorial issue. We're seeing a lot of issues with kidneys in the bodybuilding industry and in power sports in general, to be honest. And generally that's, due to the body mass, the high protein diet, which there's nothing wrong with protein, but there is when you have kidney dysfunction. There's a big problem with it. And like I said, you don't know that you have kidney dysfunction until you're in like stage 3. And that's when the shit's hitting the fan. So it's a big, big problem. And that's why, if you're going to play in these sports, you got to be getting your labs done, and you got to be getting them done and have a physician look them over, or someone who actually knows what they're doing look them over, not your bodybuilding coach, so that you don't end up in, 6 feet under, or in a position where, your heart's completely screwed.
So are you saying that telmisartan, the goal is to shut down RAS, so we're not going to be retaining sodium to increase blood pressure, but then that acts sort of like a thiazide diuretic, and it's just going to retain way too much potassium, something like someone would take for like a blood pressure lowering medication?
Yeah. So it doesn't work along the same pathway as taking diuretic, where you're just, decreasing antidiuretic hormone or whatever you're doing. Right. But it does essentially, raise potassium levels like that. So then we end up with the problem within bodybuilding. A lot of guys will take diuretics, and generally what happens is they'll take them secretly when their kidneys are, like, they don't know their kidneys are failing, but they're retaining all this water and they want to look good. Right. So then they take Lasix or something along those lines. And then we end up with other issues then, pervade within the same context of, taking telmisartan. So, Yeah, a lot of people are taking telmisartan right now as a prophylactic for RAS activation, and it is a good prophylactic. It does decrease, the albumin creatinine ratio and with kidney function and everything else. But when it's unsupervised and unrestrained, we can run into some issues.
So what's like the so what to that? Like we're seeing like all these issues specifically. I mean, obviously PEDs come with like a ton of potential side effects, but like what's the so what to that? Is that people just need to be a little bit more calculated if they're going to head down that road, or maybe like get away from specific types of special supplements, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean the actionable is like get your labs done. If you're going to dance in this arena, right? It's you have to have like labs are going to be the canary in the coal mine for any issues you may have health wise. Get your labs done and then believe them, right? Because there's a big ambivalence in sport. There's ambivalence. I mean, you're in an extreme sport with the stuff you do with ultras and stuff like that. When we're pushing the physiology to the max, and then in bodybuilding, adding PEDs, like performance enhancing drugs on top of it, which is part of the industry, then getting a good roadmap of what your health is at is going to be more and more important. It's not going to be like get your bloods done every month or every year. You want to get them done towards shows. A lot of the guys I work with that are real big dudes, we're getting bloods done every like 4 to 6 weeks because it can be that transient. Your health could be that transient in that state, just that much mass and the heavy training and the caloric intake alone is, tough to keep maintained.
And it's interesting too, like with you got most of it. I was going to ask you about being that body size for a long period of time and even like gut issues, because that seems to be like another huge thing too, is the gut microbiota. And that's something that we studied a bit in grad school. And I always tell my students, I'm like, the goal is to have the New York City of guts in the diversity of gut bacteria and gut mycoflora. Are you seeing a lot of that with the bodybuilders who you've coached and even in your own experience?
Yeah, I mean, as you probably know, gut health is like a problem for everybody. Like you can pretty much assume that every person that comes to you has some digestive issue. Bodybuilding is riddled with it. Because first off, we know that high protein diets are really tough on the guts. We know that. And when we have a really high protein diet and we're not assimilating all that protein, per meal, it ends up in the colon and then it starts selecting for protein loving bacteria. And that's why we end up with these like nasty gas, farts, these type of things, because now we're starting to ferment amino acids, right? So we're not, it's almost like anabolic resistance, but not, right? So we end up not assimilating. In bodybuilding, it gets really bad because a lot of bodybuilders are running a really hyper-inflammatory state and force feeding calories. And usually I see when people are up above 3,800 calories and they're not running endurance events, so we're just trying to get body mass up, it's really, really tough on digestion. And so what ends up happening is we say, okay, well, let's get rid of fiber, right? So we stop eating quinoa and we start eating, rice and cream of rice. We get rid of the oats and we just do cream of rice. And then vegetables start to kind of go to the wayside, and we end up with that whole chicken, rice, broccoli, repeated over and over again. But in order to have that diversity, like you said, and that density, like a New York City type thing, in order for us to have that, we need diversity and density in our diet. And so it's really funny because I help people a lot with this, and because they trust me, they end up, we get fiber intake, soluble fiber intake up above 50 grams. And it takes time to get there, but they start at like 15 grams a day because they're just not eating any fiber. And then all of a sudden they feel great. And then once we get that kind of turned around, then we can assimilate the nutrients. But the biggest problem is it's that high caloric density is really hard to get in for a lot of guys when we have a high fiber intake at the same time. So, it's an incremental process, but it's a much necessary process because, if you're not assimilating the food that you're eating and you're just like, pooping out raw blueberries and, things into the toilet, then you're really just force feeding for no reason. Right. So yeah, it's a major issue in the industry.
Are you someone, I was chatting with someone yesterday who's a bodybuilding coach, and we were talking about this idea of the research doesn't yet, or maybe it won't support this idea of like, we know you shouldn't go on like a dirty bulk or a dreamer bulk because you're going to increase just inflammation and adipose tissue far greater than muscle protein synthesis is going to give you the gains that you want. But would you have someone just eating in a modest caloric surplus of maybe 200 to 300 calories per day? Or at the upper end of things, are people very resistant to putting on muscle? So you just have to keep creeping up, creeping up, creeping up because the body doesn't want to be that big. Maybe NEAT is going up. How does that look in your experience?
Yeah, this is a neat one because I've actually put posts out that said you don't need to be in a caloric surplus to gain muscle. And it's a matter of semantics, but I mean, words matter in science, right? And so we're not actually in a caloric surplus when we're in our hyperanabolic state. What we're doing is satisfying the needs for anabolism post-exercise. And those needs go up, right? And as the body gets more muscular, our caloric needs go up. But we don't need to be, bulking up and getting to, 30, 40% body fat in order to gain muscle, right? And so there's a fine line you walk on. And so for me, it is an incremental increase in calories over time. There's no magic formula for it. We use pictures, we use body weight, and we use changes in workout volume as indications of moving forward. And so generally speaking though, when you say like, a couple hundred calories, yeah, like if we can increase calories by anywhere from 5 to 10% over the course of, a couple of weeks, then we're moving the needle, especially if body mass is either staying the same, right? And body fat's going down. So we're increasing a good body composition, or if we see body weight incrementally increase. So generally I use the same kind of mental formula for weight gain that I use for weight loss. Slow and steady is always going to be better than, rapid and super duper fast weight gain or weight loss. But in the weight gain thing, it's, if we can do half a pound to a pound, every, 2 or 3 weeks, I'm pretty happy with that. Especially, the water gets a little muddy when there's PED use on board because you can push things a little harder. But in natural athletes, you got to be really, really conscious of that, increase in caloric intake.
And they always talk about that it's way easier to diet down and maintain a good semblance of muscle mass while losing fat mass, but it's much harder to initially put on the muscle. And it's funny because I feel like there's almost like a couple of camps of, do you want to bulk and cut, or do you want to just kind of gain or maintain, whatever the term is? And I always think about it like, if you just eat in a relative, a tiny bit of a surplus, or just eat at maintenance, you're not going to bed full every night, you're not feeling gross, you're not going to feel the need to like overdo it with the cardio too much, or like be worrying about how you look in the mirror. As long as you're getting in your protein, eating nutrient dense foods, and getting quality sleep and quality training, you should be okay.
Yeah, that's the approach I take. Now, the thing is, the industry, so I came from the time of like bulk up, tone down, right? So it was like there was 50 pounds between on stage for me and 2 weeks after being on stage, to be honest. Like it was crazy amounts of weight gain post prep. Nowadays we try to keep things a little tighter. But when we're trying to gain lean mass, it's always going to be more difficult than losing fat mass. That's because we're not considering the fact that we're losing lean mass as we lose fat mass, right? So you can lose 5 pounds in a week if you want to. It's pretty darn easy, especially if you're sitting at 300 pounds, right? But at the same time, you're probably running a 50-50 split between lean mass loss and fat loss, right? So slow and steady always wins a race in this game, whether it's muscle gain or fat loss. Because at the end of the day, when we're trying to lose body fat, it's a matter of circumventing catabolic mechanisms for muscle, right? And when we're trying to gain muscle mass, it's also trying to circumvent catabolism while maximizing muscle protein synthesis. And a lot of people don't realize those two things are separate. They're separate things. Anti-catabolism is a different mechanism than, increased muscle protein synthesis. But at the end of the day, it's the difference between those two where you end up, right? So yeah, in terms of diet, if you are keeping your gut health on point and you're incrementally increasing calories, you'll remain relatively digestive stable. And those refeeds, the big refeeds, when they're, dirty bulk, tend to take away from digestive health. That then really for the days after you've had this hyper-inflammatory meal, you don't end up, really increasing anything. And so funny enough, I mentioned this because really the idea of a refeed, and this doesn't matter whether you're a runner or a bodybuilder, the idea of a refeed, if you're in a caloric deficit, is so that you can circumvent metabolic adaptation that occurs with, decreased T3, thyroid hormone, decreasing testosterone levels, and all these things that come with deep caloric restriction. And so when you refeed, you're really, really actually trying to get in a very high carbohydrate meal. You do want insulin spikes. You do want glucose spikes because that's how we get leptin to do its thing and everything else in the whole cascade of metabolic health. And so refeed diets should not be going to Five Guys and licking back, 5 burgers and a couple of fries. That's a psychological refeed. Feels good because, you get to do this because you're so restricted. But if you really want to do a proper refeed, it should be, along lines of as much of a fast glucose as possible so that you can turn on insulin, which then interacts with leptin and interacts with all the hormones that get downregulated as we go into deep caloric deficit. And then we get back to a metabolic health that we were, when we were in a maintenance phase. And that's really where the magic comes in with refeeds. There's no magic to force feeding, a bunch of like high fat, high protein food because that doesn't turn on the mechanisms that you're trying to accomplish.
How would you go about a refeed? Like you're saying you want like a good solid glucose intake in order to have, insulin be uptake. What calorie range would you look at? What types of foods would you look at? When would you implement this to make sure you're not going to specifically go into metabolic adaptation?
Yeah. So for the bodybuilders, it's usually, what I do is I'll put like if they're good with gluten and wheat and stuff, I'll put a pancake refeed at the end of the day. I generally make that refeed so big that it's hard to even finish. And I'll put it at the end of a normal day of diet, whatever that may be, whether it's, usually caloric deficit, right? So we go with the regular refeed or regular day of diet. And then it's the last meal and I give them 1 hour to eat it. And the reason why we do that is because then it doesn't become a cheat day where we then really blow over in calories. But I give it to usually around 1,500 calories for a guy that's sitting at, 38 to 4,500 calorie day. And so it's, sitting on the order of like 30, 40, 50% of total daily intake, but it's self-regulating because it's really hard to eat that many calories after a full day of eating in one sitting within an hour. And so what it does is it also gives a unrestrained refeed, so to speak, that gives that psychosocial advantage because I'm really big on the psychological characteristics of eating. And when we're in sports, right, a lot of times we eat separate to our families. So, for people with families, it's really nice because you can say, hey, Saturday night, right, have a pancake dinner, eat all your food before 4 o'clock. And at 6 o'clock, have a pancake meal with your kids and stuff. And your family's going to think you're crazy. And daddy or mommy's going to eat this stack of pancakes like this with, a cup of maple syrup on it. And then it becomes like kind of a really fun thing. So that's how I do it in those situations. I wouldn't recommend that for people who aren't in a, high performance environment. For the average person, refeeds generally occur. And I like single refeeds for this because you can plug it in and the impact, even if it has a negative impact on body weight, which it generally does the next day because of glycogen repletion and everything else, right? It goes away, right? So even if you screwed up the refeed, it's one meal. It's not going to impact you over the course of a week. But what's nice about it is if we need a refeed, which I usually judge by stalled weight loss over the course of like a week to 2 week period, despite having a relatively low caloric intake, a drop in NEAT, which I monitor through, generally like with my clients, I'll have them on my Apple Health. I'll be looking at that and seeing that their daily caloric expenditure is going down. It's not exact. The numbers aren't exact, but the change is real. And so when we see a drop in non-exercise activity thermogenesis, that usually shows up pretty well in the daily caloric expenditure. And then also when I'm talking to them, you can tell by agitation, lack of motivation, workout intensity, motivation to actually get to the gym. You have to really motivate them. That stuff starts to become really apparent, and you can nip that at the bud real quick by throwing in a refeed that's sitting on the order of 10 to 20% of the total daily calories. So if they're sitting at 1,500 calories for the day, that's pretty common to be down that low, 1,400 calories. You can add in a single meal that is like rice and honey or something along those lines at the end of the day. That's like a couple hundred calories, and you'll get that spike. And what usually happens is the next day, and you can pretty much calculate this to the T. You can say, okay, so we've taken on, let's say they're doing 400 extra calories, just to make it easy. We took on an extra 100 grams of carbohydrate, right? So you can expect about a 300 gram increase or 400 gram increase in body weight, somewhere between that, which, for our American cohorts and whatnot, that's going to be, up to like, a pound, 2 pounds even, that we'll see an increase in body weight. When you predict it, the client doesn't get scared about it, because what happens is we get it go up, and then within 4 or 5 days, we start to reestablish weight loss. And it's really cool because it's like magic. So you end up with this, if you look at a weight loss graph, and if I had one prepared, I could show you, but basically you're going down, plateau, bump up in weight, drop. Go down, plateau, bump up in weight, drop. And each time you do that, you can then look at the caloric intake as a dynamic process, as opposed to just keep dropping. And the beauty of this approach is that if you do see that someone does drop with an increase in caloric intake, right, then we know that they're in metabolic adaptation. And what will end up happening is they'll have the best workouts that they've had the day after, 2 days after, filling that liver back up with glycogen and filling the muscle back up with glycogen. Because when we're down at, 1,500, 1,300 calories doing a body comp, change, you can't get enough carbohydrate in to top up any glycogen anyway. So you're going to be putting it there anyway. So, it's an incremental process. If we do it that way incrementally, then we'll see weight loss, and then we don't have to worry about stalling out and then having to do, a full week-long, diet break to get back.
I like what you said, a few things that you said there. And one of them was that psychosocial component. And people will, I love those old, maybe bodybuilding.com or muscle and strength videos of like, oh, this person's cheat day. And it's like, you'll see them just go nuts for an entire day or two with like Five Guys or, Ben and Jerry's ice cream or like whatever it is. And it's like, you can just destroy a week or 2 or 3 of dieting by having like this just going nuts cheat day. And not only is there inflammation going up, there's brain fog, you feel terrible for like the next couple of days, but like your identity kind of shifts too, of just like, oh, like now I'm off the wagon, who cares, let's throw in the towel. But I love that idea, and I always love doing that with myself and my clients with respect to carb loading before a race. And it's a very careful, controlled, healthy carb load in the few days leading up, as we're like decreasing our physical activity, we're increasing glycogen, that we have liver and skeletal muscles, and we're just increasing that margin of this is how much potential you have psychologically and neuromuscularly of like, okay, now we can push as much as possible for that training session of that race ahead. So even just like that drive to like, let's just push this thing, it's there because you gave yourself like that bit of food that you actually needed.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because the psychosocial component is, like they're overlapping, right? Like, and I teach this in my nutrition classes, is that, you've got overlapping bio, psycho, and social components of, and you can put anything in the middle. You could put like metabolic health. You can put, you could put brain health. You can put performance, right? It's all biopsychosocial, and that's why coaches are so needed. But when you actually increase the psychosocial components, right, you also then fix the biological stuff. And all of these things are dynamic. And like a lot of times the biopsychosocial stuff is taught as a static entity, but each one is dynamic, and there's like side branches that come in to derail the process. And a lot of times, if we look at, say, for example, someone who's got body dysmorphia and they're in a sport that's aesthetic, which is real common. You could be doing a really good biological reset by doing a refeed, and it's really good in psychosocial. But all it takes is one ant to come in and say to you during that process, like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you're eating that stuff. Like, I thought you didn't eat that kind of thing. I thought you were an athlete. You're going to get fat eating that stuff," and it can derail the whole process, right? And so when it and even in in your experience with endurance athletes, right, when you're doing the taper and you're carb loading during that taper, right? If someone goes sideways, they can actually increase like inflammation and everything so much they perform like garbage on the day of the event. And that's just strictly because, you've topped things up. That's great, but you topped it up in the wrong way and too fast and in overabundance. And now by race day, you're up, 5-6 pounds, the glycogen and water retention, everything that ensues with that, blood volume, everything else. And now you're in a state where you're like now psychologically screwed on the day of your race and you feel like crap because you're inflamed. So yeah, anytime we deal with any sort of, dietary manipulation for performance or even just for aesthetics is a lot more to it than just like, plowing back calories. It's way more of an intricate process than that.
Yeah, there's so many considerations with that. One thing I wanted to touch upon that, which is very much in this ballpark, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about various electrolyte supplements. There's no shortage of supplements on the market from something which might be more isotonic, like, Gatorade or sugar-free Gatorade. And then you have something a little bit more hypertonic or a little bit more salty, such as like maybe Liquid IV. And you have something like Element, which might be the granddaddy of them all with like 1 gram of salt per serving. What is your take? What is your sort of prescription, scientific backing that you would say like, this might be helpful in this population. It may not be as helpful in this population. I'm interested to see what you have to say.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny because hydration is such a screwed up thing right now. Everybody thinks they're hydrating when they're drinking a gallon of water a day, and then they become hypovolemic it's so hypotonic that they're not holding on to any of that volume and they're flushing salt out. So they're actually, having issues with retaining the hydration. They're just peeing all day. And then on the other side of the coin, right, then we throw in, for example, you said Element, a gram of salt, I think 400 milligrams of potassium. If you're not sweating and losing blood volume, then that's not going to help you whatsoever. You're going to be retaining blood volume and become hypervolemic in the face of not losing any sweat. And so the way I do it, and this is like, physiological, is that high salt is what we need when we're trying to increase extracellular volume, which is mainly our blood plasma. And so where do we lose blood plasma? Through our sweat. So a lot of my athletes, I'll have them weigh in to get an idea of what they're losing for sweat loss, right? Especially when we're online, weigh in before and after their training. And I'll see a lot of guys losing like 2-3 pounds, right? During a heavy training session, especially with endurance training where, it's real hot. And so that's when we want to get that hypertonic fluids in after the training session so that we're retaining that blood volume. But the problem is that people are using this stuff throughout the day, all day long. So they might have 3, elements a day, right? And, or even like with Relight, like that one's also a real salty one and it's a scoop. And once you start tasting salt, it gets tasty and salt makes you thirsty, right? So then if you're drinking that all day long, you're just, you're taking in 3 grams of salt just from these drinks. And without having enough potassium on board, and potassium on the other side of the coin, it is what retains our intracellular volume and what, keeps our cells hydrated, which is what we're trying to achieve. And so there's a mismatch in the industry right now where, sodium's great when we're trying to get back sodium from sweat loss and blood volume from sweat loss. But potassium is awesome. And we want potassium to sit at 2 to 4 times higher than sodium when we're trying to get intracellular hydration to be maintained. And so it's funny because a lot of times, and the other part we miss say a lot of times is like glucose. Glucose is a major, major, major blood volume enhancer. We can expand blood volume really well with glucose. And so when we look at these hydration protocols that people are kind of making up themselves, generally speaking, we can be actually like dehydrated despite drinking a whole bunch of fluids. And that's because we're not getting the fluids into the cell. We're keeping it in the blood volume because we've got so much salt there that it has to be diluted. Our body, where our osmoreceptors and our friggin' hypothalamus are going to be telling us, drink more water. And if we're drinking more salt and water, then it's going to be like, drink more water. And we just keep on expanding plasma volume. And so it's highly important for people to understand that, when we're replacing fluids, it's really, really important for salt to be high. But when we're not sweating in our workouts, it's a high chance that our extracellular volume, our blood volume is going to be very good. I don't know where we'd be losing it from otherwise. And so funny stuff about glucose and Gatorade. Gatorade is like, and I have no affiliation with Gatorade whatsoever, but Gatorade's a really heavily studied, the Gatorade Research Institute. Like it's a very it funds good research. When I was at Yale, the lab was funded by the Gatorade Research Institute. And we were using it for plasma volume expansion and looking at it in astronauts, coming up with countermeasures for blood pressure problems when they come from the space station down to Earth. And, it's kind of funny because the reason why people say, it's bad is because it has glucose in it, but the glucose is there on purpose for blood volume expansion. That's what it's there for. So yeah, a lot of misinformation out there. But the salt thing is really a post sweaty period, or when you're running like a marathon and you've got pounds of sweat loss over time. You got to replace that and you got to keep it on board. You don't want to be stopping every minute to take a pee because you're flushing out salt, so yeah.
There's so many things that we can branch off with that. And it's funny because I was speaking with this medical doctor. I went to like a few weddings this summer and him and I just started talking about like hydration, and he was asking me about the ultra marathons and running for 12 hours or 24 hours or whatever I was doing. And he goes, well, how do you stay hydrated? And I said, for the longest time until I started digging into the research myself, I didn't know what to do. And my former athletes didn't know what to do either. But then I started studying this in grad school and we started talking about the sodium glucose link transporters, in that, yeah, you can do your job with having, some mix of sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, calcium, and some electrolyte supplement. That's all good and well if it's in like a science-backed formulation. But without having glucose, you're not really going to be able to increase that blood volume. And as your glycogen starts to go down, you're chugging down the electrolytes and you're peeing clear, but you're like, wait, what is happening right now?
Yep.
So I love that you put that part at the end, because I belong to the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. I read all their research, I get all their emails. I have like a whole like backpack and everything they sent me. And I'm like, I love their science-backed formulation, and I have no affiliation either, because it is science-backed and you do need that ratio, that isotonic ratio, along with glucose to rehydrate, replenish and refuel to get you back going again.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because we all learn about like how fluids move between, like solutes and solvents move in I think in like high school. We might even learn about it in grade school now.
It's straight up osmosis. Yeah, it's like
right,
water follows solutes.
right. And so it's really logical. When you think about it, I guess for people that kind of studied that stuff, I guess it's more logical, but it's really logical. And that's why the tonicity of the fluids that you're drinking, the stuff that's in it, becomes really, really important. And, I formulate for a ton of companies, and it's so funny because they'll say, I want to do a hydration drink. And I'll be like, well, what kind of hydration are we talking here? Are we talking about something that people are just going to drink every day? And just like, so that they have the right amount of water on board and the right amount of electrolytes? Or are we talking about something that when someone's pushing the envelope and sweating out a couple pounds per hour, trying to get that back on board? And then the other one is, especially in your sports, right, is that if we don't use something isotonic, right, then we end up with the issue of drawing volume out of the blood into the guts so that we can balance the tonicity so that it can go in the right direction. And that's why, when we drink a big sugary fluid that's high in salt, we feel bloated afterward because we're actually dehydrating. We're pulling blood volume out in order to kind of get things balanced so that then they can be driven back in. So it's there's a lot of misinformation out there on hydration, and it's crazy the performance increase you get with people when you get them hydrated properly. Like, I mean, like I think it's like a couple percent decrease in hydration status can lead to like 15-20% decrease in performance. So pretty easy fix. Follow the science, follow guys like yourself that know what they're doing, and then, you know, we can get places with it.
You had brought up orthostatic intolerance and space research, and it completely skipped my mind because we studied the baroreceptor reflex a bit in grad school, and one of my professors had done her postdoc at Yale. And you're wearing this Yale shirt. I know you came out of Yale. What can you tell me about orthostatic intolerance, total peripheral resistance, and
I bet you was in my lab.
Yeah,
I bet he was at the JB Pierce lab for sure. Oh yeah, because that's the only place
Pierce,
that.
I remember.
Yeah,
the name,
yeah, he was at Pierce lab. Yeah, that's funny.
It just hit me now. We've been talking for a couple hours.
Well, like, isn't that funny? So it's funny. So I did my master's in this, right? And I actually created a low body positive pressure device that basically I was restoring
lower body negative pressure.
Yeah. I was using positive pressure to restore blood volume post exercise, because post exercise hypotension, right? And so we were looking at thermoregulatory reflexes in the face of post exercise hypotension. And because you have competing reflexes, right? You've got thermoregulatory reflexes want to dilate skin. We want to sweat, right? We want to do things that are going to lower blood pressure. We're going to lower blood volume through sweat. We're going to be also dilating vessels in the skin. Skin's a massive organ, so we can actually get hypotension. Then what happens, right, is that we start decreasing baroreceptor firing, and then sympathetic nerve activity goes up because it's trying to maintain pressure and maintain volume, right? So that's when the RAS system comes on and everything else that we were talking earlier. So my hypothesis was, okay, so after exercise, if I put someone under a thermic stress through exercise, cardiovascular and thermic competing reflexes, throw them in an upright position into a box that's sealed at the waist, and put a water perfused suit on them that then clamps skin temperature, right? And then drive blood volume from the legs back up into the central blood volume. Can I recover thermal homeostasis and cardiovascular homeostasis at the same time? Because the question is, why do people run Boston or run these marathons and they make it across the line and then they pass out? And it's because the skeletal muscle pump's gone and everything else is gone, right? Now we're blood volume pools in the legs, orthostatic intolerance. So funny enough is orthostatic intolerance can be part of everybody's life, right? If we're low in blood volume and we have dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, then it's going to pool in the legs because of gravity. And, the brain senses this, puts us horizontal, gravitational forces go away, and away we go. But interestingly enough, the research that we did at Yale and subsequently actually at Western University, we were looking at space flight, because we get autonomic dysregulation when astronauts come back down to Earth. And when you're up there for a long time in the space station, it becomes really problematic. It was problematic on the space shuttle. That's why you never saw an interview when they're getting off the space shuttle. They were hucked away and like taken to the hospital. So we see this with extended bed rest. So if we do extended bed rest studies for like weeks on end in bed, that takes away the gravitational forces in the body. The baroreceptors become unresponsive or at least desensitized, and so when we go vertical, blood pools. And so there are some countermeasures for that we worked on a lot at Yale. One of them was doing these really high watt cycling exercises while infusing like massive amounts of glucose. We were doing looking at glycerol infusions and these different things, and trying to see if we can maintain blood volume. Because the biggest problem is if we can't maintain blood volume, right? Because when we go horizontal, when pressure goes up, we pee a lot, right? So it's orthostatic intolerance is a pretty complicated, really cool mechanism that goes sideways, right? It's a sideways mechanism on the baroreceptors, but it's something that people don't even realize how important the baroreflex is to moving. And in fact, it's funny because baroreflex resetting during exercise is a necessary component of exercise, because we've only got 5 to 6 liters of blood to go around. And if we have big legs, we can pretty much hold that blood volume in our legs. So how does the body allow for us to get perfusion? It allows for blood pressure to go up. And so during training, our blood pressure can go up, 200 millimeters of mercury. It can be up real high, right? It's a healthy response to training. But then after training, how do we combat this blood pooling and everything else? By clamping down on those vessels and trying to maintain blood pressure. And then we get back to a set point of like 120/80, right? That we want to be at. So it's a cool mechanism. It's not only regulated through the exercise response. So you've probably seen studies where they do they hypnotize the people in MRIs and look at like the insular cortex and all these different parts of the brain that are involved in cardiovascular homeostasis. And just thinking about exercises, it raises blood pressure and fires off these places in the autonomic nervous system in the upper cerebrum that then set us up for exercise and blood pooling and everything else so we don't pass out when we're training. So it's a super neat thing. And then the other part is then you have the chemoreflex, right, that comes in, that as we start to produce metabolites, that also drives blood pressure up. It shifts that whole sigmoidal curve to the right and upward, right? So we end up with this really cool blood pressure response due to exercise that we've adapted over time because we're on Earth with high gravity. So it's a really cool thing.
Yeah, I remember reading in Chris Hadfield's book and then Scott Kelly's book when I think Scott Kelly and his brother might have like the longest amount of time in space. And Chris Hadfield's up there too. And they talked about what it's like to come back down to Earth and try to just like understand how gravity works, how your body feels. And at that time when we were studying the pressor reflex, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like your body basically just has to reset. And something not too dissimilar when you're like severely dehydrated and you stand up from a sitting position, or if you're dealing with like, like end stage, cardiac issues as like an old person, you can't increase total peripheral resistance to get blood back up from pooling in your legs. And it's just so brilliant to talk about. And like, no one talks about that. And I like the way that you had distilled it from someone running, and then passing out the finish line. It wasn't like so much like only a neurological thing going on. It's an actual just sympathetic nervous system thing going on as well, and autonomic.
And that's what it is, right? Because you're coming across likely hypovolemic, like you've lost a lot of sweat. You probably haven't replaced the amount of fluids that you've lost. So right off the bat, pressure is going to be down. And because you're not moving, right, we don't have that skeletal muscle pump that's, basically squeezing those muscle fibers around those venules that have little, one-way valves that then every time the muscle contracts and shortens, we can push blood back for venous return. So that goes away. And so cardiac output goes down, right? And then we also have issues with total peripheral resistance because we're sweating and we're hot, right? So resistance is low. And the beauty of, looking at these mechanisms is that it's a linear equation. Mean arterial pressure is cardiac output times total peripheral resistance, or cardiac output's heart rate times stroke volume. And then we multiply that. So we can just muck around with what are the mechanisms that control each one of those variables, right? And what it means. And at the end of the day, it's, if the volume's not there, then stroke volume is going to be low. Heart rate has to go up, right? And if we don't maintain total peripheral resistance or increase it, then we still have a drop in blood pressure that can be a problem. And just the opposite occurs in people who have autonomic dysregulation on the other side, where, they've got high heart rates due to some metabolic conditions, and they've got high total peripheral resistance due to stress, lack of sleep, poor diet, environmental factors. We can have hypertension. And so, understanding the barrel reflex, I feel is a really important thing for coaches that are involved in exercise, because then we can look at metrics like just heart rate and know whether someone's hydrated or not, overtraining or not, both. Because, if it's elevated and blood pressure is elevated, then there's a high likelihood that the other two components aren't really getting regulated properly. So yeah, it's, I love this stuff. That was my area of research for years. And I absolutely love it.
It's funny because one thing that's getting really hot right now on social media is people who have wearables, and they talk about like HRV. And I think that HRV is really cool to look at it may not be adequately studied with specific wearables, and some people might not need to stick with their data specifically. Like it might be not accurate but precise respect to them. And like the people who I've coached with respect to like marathon training, I'm always big on the heart rate zones, and that brings in the idea of cardiac drift and like what's happening towards the end of a long training run and towards the end of a race. And if you're looking at something, environmental factors you just brought up, as you're losing blood volume and you still want to be able to circulate 5 liters per minute, you might not have 5 liters per minute of cardiac output to give. And stroke volume is pretty much going to remain the same. And heart rate just has to climb, 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 climb. And people think they need to push, 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 push. And I was just running this marathon over the weekend, and it was 82 degrees in South Carolina, and it was humid. And I started to slow down my pace and start to fast walk towards the end because I wanted to stay within like zone 2. I didn't want to have any issues. And I saw a couple of people kind of keeled over, a couple of people cramping, a couple of people passed out from dehydration. And I was like, I did my homework and I hydrated throughout. Cardiac drift wasn't an issue for me, but for them, it was a different story. And they're like screaming out in the air, the whole David Goggins thing about, oh, just keep going. And I was like, hey, there's also a safety component too, where yeah, you can stay hard, but also follow the science and get to that finish line safely.
Yeah, grit is not going to overcome cardiovascular homeostasis when we don't have the ability to maintain pressure to get things to the brain. That's all there is to it. And yeah, and that's what with my master's work, what we found out was that the body will preserve cardiovascular homeostasis, blood pressure homeostasis over thermal homeostasis. And so that's when it becomes a real problem because we can end up being like overheated quite easily while the body's trying to get pressure back. And that's why we go horizontal when we reach a point in, it's a really cool evolutionary design for us just to pass out when we need to like get rid of gravitational forces, right? And I always thought that was amazing, right? That the body says, okay, well, I can't get enough blood to the brain from the feet because we got, the 9.71 newtons of force or whatever the heck it is from gravity, pulling everything down. Blood's heavy. It's got a lot of particulate in it. It's got iron central molecule and the hemoglobin. It's going to go down, right? And so it puts you horizontal. And then you wake up and you're like, well, what happened? And usually if you measure someone's core temperature at that point, it's actually through the roof too, because the body can't dilate because it's trying to maintain blood pressure to get blood back to the head. So it's, it's key when someone's running especially these ultras and everything else, because you're also not, you're dealing with blood pressure homeostasis issues due to just volemic changes and heat changes. But you've also got the issue of neurological breakdown, right? And that's where the grit part, you got to use grit to get through the pain, but you got to listen to your body and read your metrics, like you were saying, like heart rate zones or whatever, to understand that like, I'm only, I'm running at half pace, but I'm at zone 5, right? The workload ain't matching the heart rate. This means that there's something else that's driving heart rate, and it's probably blood volume and due to like, the fact that we've dilated skin and we've lost a lot of blood volume because we've sweated our face off for the last, several hours. So yeah, and that's where the hydration stuff we just talked about becomes so freaking important, because you at least get rid of that component, or at least control that component. Because otherwise, yeah, you're going to be like those other people, barfing and falling over and, everything else that's involved with, these issues with blood pressure.
It's funny. I just had this exact same conversation with like one of my clients she lives in Norway, and it's like pretty cold there most of the year, and regularly races in like 100+ mile races. And one of them's like the Western States Endurance Run in California. And that's like around like June 25th ish, like sometimes like early July.
That'd be hot.
And sometimes it gets like in the valley section, like well over 110 degrees. And she's been having like some like hydration issues. And we were talking about this. She's like, oh, like, why am I having all these like hydration issues? And I'm like, well, your training climate might be 30, 40, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you're going to ask your body to do 100+ degrees for 100 miles with maybe 20,000 feet of elevation, and you're not staying on top of your hydration. That's why you're having so many issues. And it's like, oh, but I think I'm drinking. It's like, well, you might need to drink even more. And I love that piece that you put in of your heart rate's at a zone 5, but you're only putting in like a zone 2 effort. So you're looking at your watch and you're like, oh, I'm running a 12-minute mile, but my heart rate's at 160. It's like, well, there's something wrong there, and we need to have that conversation. So for me, like, fueling always comes first before the exercise.
100%. You know, and it's funny too when you think hydration, you're talking about people exercising and or performing in different environments. When we're performing in cool environments, even when we sweat, we have a difference in the amount of salt. Like as an athlete, our body starts to adapt to how much salt loss we're going to have, like sodium itself, in the sweat, right? So people who just first start training, there's a lot of sodium loss, right? And they can taste it. You can see it on their jerseys and everything else, right? And then as training and proper hydration status ensue over time, the body adapts to losing less sodium and more water. And it's pretty cool because when you look at people that are now doing most of their training in a cold environment, right? And then they come into a warm environment, there's a high likelihood that adaptation hasn't fully taken hold. And so their sodium losses become great when they're in these hot climates, when they're used to training in a cool climate. And so it's you know, there's so much involved in the process that performance in different environments, environmental performance, is, you know, an adaptation. Just like if you're going from sea level to, you know, running at 10,000 feet, you know, you're not going to do real well training against Sherpas that have been living at 10,000 feet and have a, you know, a massive hematocrit from doing so. Right. Same things with hydration. Our body will adapt to the climate that we train in. And we have to be really, really careful of that, especially when we're dealing with high performance stuff. And I'll tell you, runners, man, you know, I've worked with a lot of endurance athletes, and it's really funny because runners in general, and I mean, hey, this is just my take on it, have the least worry about the dietary and all that kind of stuff. Like they just go out and run, and they, you know, you have bodybuilders that aren't sweating at all, and you know, and they're like hydrating. They have their gallon jug walking around them, and they get runners, and you're trying to get them to drink 3 liters a day. And they're running, you know, 20K, 30K a day. And you're like, wow, like it's wild because, you know, those little tweaks can make the difference between someone qualifying for a major event and, like, you know, lagging around at the back. So it's super important. Blood pressure wise, thermal homeostasis wise, and endurance athletes are just, they're another breed, man. It's so cool. Like the stuff you do is just so remarkable as a physiological stress. It's just unbelievable.
Well, it's bananas how many even professional ultra marathon runners who might do 100-mile races and 200-plus-mile races, they'll be like, oh, I couldn't stop throwing up. And then you talk to them, be like, well, what are you eating? What are you drinking? They're like, oh, well, I had a little bit of this. I had a little bit of that.
I had a bagel and a banana before I started. And
it's like, oh, it was a bad GI day. I'm like, how do you get yourself to maybe run upwards of even 120 to 150 miles a week? And a lot of them go into Colorado to train at altitude, and they're running. And like you, as you said perfectly, they don't really care about what they're eating and drinking for the most part. Again, you have these bodybuilders who it's like, oh, we're going to have 3,400 calories. I'm like, man, I weigh 165 pounds and I eat close to 4,000 a day. So for
exactly,
me,
right?
It's like, I'm just shoveling it in. Like I can't get in enough food, and I'm a very tiny person.
Yeah, and that's usually the problem, right? Is you can't get enough food in. And then you look at people that are running some of these races, and they're like they're eating like, you know, 2,500 calories. Some of the women that I've dealt with that just run like marathons, but I mean they're marathons. They're eating like 1,400 calories when they come to me, and then I'm like, watch this. Wait till we start loading you up with some carbohydrates and see how much you perform. And a little reluctant at the beginning, and then all of a sudden they realize that, holy crap, like I've been underfeeding and underhydrating this whole time. And it's even funnier when you look at the supplement industry within the endurance sport realm. And again, hey, I have no affiliations with anybody, and I don't really care about these companies. But like when you look at like something like Eload, like that was kind of the, you know, the standard of practice for so long. You look at the actual formulation, it's really not that great, or at least it wasn't, you know, back say 15 years ago. And so, you know, there's a lot of room for improvement with diet and hydration status in the endurance realm. And the people that, it's another breed like yourself, like you have a physiological advantage. Somehow, like, you know, somehow people that run ultras and whatnot, they're a different breed, so to speak. And it's not like a mental thing so much, but it's like your mitochondrial density, your slow twitch complement, how big your lactate sink is. All those things come into play. And the genetic component, I think, plays a massive role in how people are attracted to endurance sport. Like I ran 10Ks a day when I was a pro motocross racer, and it was like it felt like someone was pulling my teeth out every time I did it, but I knew I had to do it to have the endurance for the sport I was doing. And then I see other people like, my wife who goes out and runs a 10K, like it's just for shits and giggles. It's not a training thing. It's not anything else at all. It's unbelievable to me. And I'm a mountain biker, right? And I love mountain biking. But again, I raced criterium on road cycle. And it's funny because when I first started doing that, I wouldn't be like loaded up on carbohydrates, and I would gain weight over the racing season, especially if we were doing like century rides and stuff, because I'd come home and I'd like just fill like a pot with a large packet of a thing of what I was doing was a cinnamon toast crunch and a gallon of milk, right? And I'd eat that, and it was funny because as soon as I started using gels, my performance went through the roof, and my propensity to overeat after the training session wasn't there. I just have a normal meal. And it's because you're incrementally giving yourself those 100 calories, like, 25 grams of carbohydrate. I was doing like every 30 minutes, and man, oh man, what a difference it made. And I do that now with a lot of my clients that aren't into the competitive running, but they run. I'll say, listen, we're not getting your body comp where you want it. Try adding in gels every 30 to 45 minutes of your run, and let's see where your body comp goes. And it always gets better. And it's because they're literally fueling the exercise so they can actually perform harder. The calorie burn might be higher, right? But they're not coming out of it completely glycogen depleted and then not being able to, they have to force feed themselves to get back and overshooting. And then we see body weight start to regulate itself. So it's, and the same with hydration, right? A lot of these people, I don't know if you do any body comp type people, but within the people that we're speaking to out here in the wild world of the intrawebs, if people are having trouble with body weight fluctuating from a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, whatever that may look like, and it might be 1 to 2 pounds, it's purely hydration status. And if they want to get that regulated and they're not sweaty people, they're not going out and sweating a lot, back off on the sodium. Make sure you're getting a potassium, get some coconut water or something like that in. And if you're getting enough potassium, which generally is tough when you have a low calorie diet, you'll find that those things level out. And then you no longer have those psychological variables of body weight fluctuating all over the place that kind of make it so it's difficult to actually know even where you're at.
With the, it's funny you brought up with like having the gels throughout as opposed to just backloading your carbohydrates, because I remember seeing this. I mean, there's really no shortage of studies talking about glycogen resynthesis rates and even muscle protein synthesis rates, and how like carbohydrates and proteins are going to help replenish you as quickly as possible. But I remember my professor during, I think, my master's showing us this graph of pulse feeding versus bolus feeding and glycogen resynthesis and muscle protein synthesis. And he's like, bolus feeding is you eat like 1 or 2 or 3 big boluses per day, maybe breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or just 2 big meals. And then with the pulse feeding, you eat every 2 to 4 hours, like as needed. And as an athlete, if you're doing a morning session and an afternoon session, you're thinking pre-workout, post-workout, pre-workout, post-workout, something before bed, like a casein before bed or some slow digesting protein, whatever it is. And the more that I've been in the endurance sport, the more I've coached people and just talked with folks, it's been the exact same story of if you don't let your glycogen tank run absolutely incredibly low to the point where you're getting brain fogged and you're cramping up and you don't want to be there anymore. If, as you said, you put in those 100-calorie gels every 20 to 30 minutes, you maintain the intensity, you remain cognitively strong. You're also getting in a little bit of those electrolytes as well. And then you finish the training session feeling good. And this past weekend, I think I had 5 gels during the race, and it was my healthiest marathon post-meal day where I had quite a bit of fruits and vegetables, a lot of lean proteins, and no garbage. It wasn't until the next day that I celebrated with my girlfriend that we went out and got some pizza. But I was like, man, good for me, man. I had 5 gels and I had no junk food afterwards. And it really works.
It does work. And I mean, we're only talking about 500 calories. Like it's nothing,
It
right?
was a 5,500 calorie burn day for me.
That's what I was going to say.
Because
You
I was
probably
pretty
burned
active
5,000.
outside of the
Yeah.
race too. And I looked at like my Apple Watch and I was like, okay, burned 5,500 calories today. And I was like, yeah, 500 calories, whatever.
Oh, it's like wind, blowing off your hair. Yeah. And it's funny too, because, with all the misinformation that's out there in the, in the social media space about people that don't understand like how carbohydrates are metabolized and everything else going on about glucose spikes and insulin spikes and all this bullshit. It becomes, the water gets really muddy. And so when you're dealing with someone that started, and a lot of like people will start running to lose weight for calorie burn. And then they realize they have this genetic component that they're like, whoa, I'm actually good at this. The propensity to eat carbohydrates can still be very, very low. In fact, there can be resistance to increasing carbohydrate intake. And it's really hard to get people to think that, hey, if we fuel the endeavor and we don't let, our liver glycogen go down to nothing, then we will be actually in a better caloric balance afterward, that then we don't have a propensity to actually overeat or be grumpy or whatever it may be. And like you said, it's funny, right? Because a lot of people don't realize that, like, even people that do ketogenic diets and whatnot, they'll say like, my blood glucose, we don't want that to go up. It's like, dude, your liver is going to be spitting out glucose from glycogen into the blood as needed. Your blood glucose doesn't go down to 2 millimolar. That's brain damage, right? It's going to maintain it around 4 millimolar, and it's going to stay there. And it doesn't matter what you do. It's either going to be taking it from the liver, and when that gets depleted, it's going to start breaking down amino acids so that we can create glucose to put it in the blood. And so at the end of the day, when people are saying to themselves, well, I want to increase muscle, lose body fat, I want to run, I want to perform well and do all this stuff. If you're not feeding the performance, then you're actually doing the opposite. You're breaking down muscle mass, right? And you're going to have less propensity to perform. So that calorie burn you were looking for is going to be not maximized anyway. A day like yourself, like 5,500 calories in the day, like that's massive. And think about it. You also have, the fact that you need to have your basal metabolic rate satisfied. So you're 5,500 calories in the hole. Like you're in the hole. And when you're in the hole that deep, you got to eat some serious food to put it all back. And so people that come out of a marathon, right? Like the reason why you can actually, you said like you're very active after marathons or whatever, because you're feeding yourself, right? People feel like crap after marathons generally because there would be blisters on their feet, but also they're not feeding the actual performance. So they're in a deficit, and they're in a deep deficit. It's going to take weeks to come back if they're only eating 1,500 to 2,500 calories a day. And so the ultra marathon women that I've worked with, I've had them start out with me like literally at 1,500 calories. Like, are you serious about this? They're at 4,000, 5,000 calories, and still they just can't eat more. They just can't feed the machine anymore. If they could, they would, right? And that's the whole paradox, right? Is really, the machine will run if you give it fuel.
Well, it's interesting with that because I don't know. I've always erred on the side of caution of I'd rather have I'd rather be a little bit more over prepared with respect to training, with respect to knowing the course, with respect to fueling, electrolytes, glucose, protein, things like that. And I remember when I was training for my first 50-mile race and I was running about 100 to 110 miles a week. And I was doing full body resistance training about 4 days a week while I was doing my PhD. And it was the year after COVID. I mean, and I was living with 4 roommates in a 3-bedroom apartment. Like it was nuts. And
I miss those days, by the way.
Do you?
All the roommates. Oh yeah, you will too one day. Trust me.
Well, it was exciting, but I mean, I was poor, but yeah, it was.
Well, it's fun being poor. You'll see it. You'll see it one day. Yeah, but anyway,
I'm still climbing my way out of it.
That's right. Exactly. You're still trauma. You still have trauma from it, right?
Yeah, today's terms. Yeah. But it's funny because I came out of that race and I fueled up so well during the 50 miler, and it was on a trail, and I ran it in like just about 10 hours, and on a trail 50 miles, and I walked away and I was like, all right, cool, we're good. And my friends were like, do you need help to the car? Are you good? And I was like, no, like I'm fine. because I ate so much food during, I only trained for 6 weeks, like to get ready for the race. Cause I was already like regularly running marathons. And I said, let's just like, turn up the dial like a little bit with respect to the training and with respect to the eating. But I was just eating so many carbs and I got used to it that during the race, it really wasn't an issue. It was like, okay, I'm just going to run like a zone 2 50-mile race. And it was about 60 degrees on a relatively flat trail in Philadelphia. I ran about 10 hours. And I came out, I was like, hey, who wants to go out to dinner? And they're like, are you sure? I was like, yeah, I mean, I smell a little bit. I'll put on some deodorant, but otherwise, like, I want to go out and party. And they were just like, how? And I was like, I literally just, I was aerobic. I was clearing lactate faster than I was building it up. And I stayed hydrated and I stayed fueled up. And I was great. And like the next day I went to the gym. It was great.
That's the key right there is you, and you know, the biggest aspect I think of the racing is the ability to circumvent going anaerobic during that time, right? Because the moment that we start accumulating lactate and we can't, we don't have the slow twitch complement, the lactate sink, if you will, to be able to take care of that. That's really the biggest problem, I think, in endurance sport and actually in sport in general. That's why it's funny, because right now, like in the power sports and whatnot, and just aesthetics, people are like, well, cardio is useless; it doesn't burn any calories. And I'm like, holy crap! When did cardio become a calorie burn thing at the end of a training session? Because when I was being trained in exercise physiology, we used it actually like so long, slow distance stuff, where we're at 70% or less heart rate max. That was actually to increase your lactate sink, to train the slow twitch, so that we could take up lactate from the training session, so that we could recover better after the training session. And that was the whole idea behind it. And the better that lactate sink is, the more you can push without going lactic, right? Or feeling lactic, because you're chewing up lactate while you're producing it. And if people focused on zones, like you mentioned, in their training more closely, and did have that zone 1, 2, maybe pushing a little bit into 3 as a background of slow twitch training, right? Type 1 fiber training, then when they push into higher zones and start doing like, we used to call it like over and under or redlining and all those different types of training, you can actually increase that your propensity to handle lactate, which means you're faster, right? And also means you got a bigger spread for when the shit hits the fan and you're feeling a little bit like crap. You can back off, but you're still fast, right? And it's funny how people have lost that connection with like the slow component of training. It's not to do with calorie burn. It's got to do with training mitochondria and those high mitochondrial density muscle fibers to be able to handle what we do when we go lactic, or to stop us from feeling like we're going fully lactic because we're burning it up. And it's key. It's key to performance. And the key to it too is that if we're not supplying substrates for aerobic performance, glucose, then it's going to be harder to get there, because if we're going through beta oxidation to get fat to become the substrates that glucose give us, right? So acetyl-CoA, it's going to freaking take a long time, because it's a biochemical process. It takes a way more. You got to break things down and put it into this and do it all that, and then come into the same Krebs cycle and electron transport chain when we're done. And so it's all same final common pathway. And so if we want to perform, we got to supply the active ingredient. And if we supply that active ingredient, then it means increasing carbohydrate intake. And the problem is we got all these people wearing continuous glucose monitors, and then they have carbohydrate and they go, whoa, my glucose went up. And you're like, yeah, it's supposed to happen. Oh, my insulin, I'm going to be hyperinsulinic. It's exactly what's supposed to happen, right? There's nothing wrong with that.
It's funny because I go see like a retina specialist like every like 6 months, like a retina issue, and the doctor was talking to me about something, and he goes, hey man, you have some pretty veiny arms. He's like, what do you do? I was like, I lift, I run a lot, yada yada yada. And he goes, oh, like, I try not to do too much of this or too much of that. And he goes, what do you eat? And my girlfriend was with me and she laughed. She goes, oh, this guy eats like so many bananas and so much protein, all this different stuff. He goes, oh, no. Bananas spike my blood glucose. I don't need any of those. And I was like, okay, granted, like you're medical doctor, retina specialist, you're brilliant at knowing the back of the eye, but like you are a medical doctor. And there is a bit of misinformation out there right now with respect to people being, I don't know if they want to call it metabolic flexibility, if they understand what that means, burning off both carbohydrates and fats as fuel, or people, as you said, are basically afraid of glucose spikes and therefore insulin spikes, and they think they're going to become insulin resistant down the road. So they're like, oh, I'm a fat adapted athlete. Yet you look at them and they're like trying to do the high rocks or hydrox competitions or whatever it is, and they're trying to redline. And I'm like, you can't be breaking down fatty acids for fuel while you're in an anaerobic state. It doesn't work like that. And as you said, the final common pathway is basically gluconeogenesis. You're going to create blood glucose, whether you're going to give it to yourself
you like
or
it or
not.
not.
And you're not going to want to go through like deamination because you want proteins to go to muscle protein synthesis and decreasing muscle protein breakdown. Where did this start?
It started with ketogenic diets and people losing a lot of weight fast on ketogenic diets because they lose glycogen. they become glycogen depleted. So you lose 5 pounds in a week, and it's because you've lost that water retention and everything that comes along with glycogen. And then from there, it's like, well, I can just eat, fatty foods, and that's delicious and good. And so then all of a sudden glucose becomes an evil thing. And that's when I saw it to make a big shift when ketogenic diets became like kind of the thing for weight loss. And now what's happened is we've got a lot of people with metabolic dysregulation, with metabolic syndrome, and they can't process carbohydrates properly, or assimilate and then utilize them properly. So we do have issues with hyperglycemia. We do have problems with hyperinsulinemia. Absolutely, because we're not doing the GLUT4 thing and taking everything into the muscle and into the liver properly. But here's the thing, is that we've extrapolated all that information and turned it into like a regular healthy person information. And now people think that whenever insulin goes up, it's going to cause fat gain. And we're like, no. Like, that's where you're getting it all wrong, is that when we eat a carbohydrate food and we do get a glucose spike, which we will get no matter what, that's the whole idea. That's what signals the pancreas to do its job, to put out that insulin, so that we actually then take that glucose and put it either into skeletal muscle or liver, so that in other places we can store it as glycogen, or we can put it through, lipogenesis, so we can store it as fat. And those processes, right, aren't evil processes. They're designed perfectly. And so long as, if we're athletic and we're burning carbohydrate, we're burning it from glycogen. And if we're doing that, then it's okay, because the mechanisms, we'll get even better insulin spikes, right? Because then we're gonna get even better drive of that glucose into the areas that are depleted muscularly. And where it got just screwed up is because we have, with the with the whole social media craze, athletes now want to be very, very ripped all the time. And I teach this in my nutrition classes on body comp. Like, linebackers have a certain level of body fat and they're selected for through performance, right? And so you end up with linebackers usually holding a little more body fat than, say, a running back. Well, that makes sense, right? And it's funny, right? The really good quarterbacks are usually like lean and short and smaller than the linebackers. And that's because their role is dictated by, the performance they have. And that performance is then dictated by body composition and everything else. And so we got to stop thinking that every single person that's an athlete needs to look like a fitness athlete going on stage in a pair of, skibbies posing their muscles. And that's where I think the real big disconnect came in, is that the metabolic syndrome stuff crossed over into athletics. And now we've got young athletes, and they're like, teens and 20s, worried about whether their abs are going to be there or not if they take in 2 gels during a run. And it's like, these are, like we said, it's like wind in your hair. It's not even like your body's, the benefits you're going to get from it are going to be so paramount compared to like any sort of body composition thing. but people are afraid of them. Like people are eating 150 grams of carbs a day and running. And it's like, you're burning that thing. You're burning that up, like chewing it up in twofold in a run. So you're chewing up muscle. That's all there is to it, because we got to create glucose from something, right? And if we don't have any body fat and we don't have any glucose on board or glycogen storage that's adequate, then we're going to chew up muscle. That's all that's going to happen, right?
There's almost like no arguing, so to speak, of like maybe who are some of the fittest athletes on the planet. And I think that maybe Ironman triathlon competitors, like if you look at their splits of, what is it, swimming 2.4 miles, biking 112, and then running a marathon, they can throw down a 2:38 marathon after biking 112 and after swimming 2.4. And I love like the research which comes out detailing like the near linear correlation between like the fastest finishing times and the amount of carbohydrates ingested per hour. And like I was just talking to Katarina Hartmouth, who's like she won the Tour de Gaunt, which is like a 200-mile ultra marathon, and she smoked everyone. And I was like, what's your nutrition like? She goes, I try to get in like upwards of 90 to 100 grams per hour, like while I train. And I was like, even during a 200-mile race, she's like, yeah. Like, what?
Yeah.
And she's smoking everyone else. There's no bonk there. There's nothing. And I was like, yeah, like the proof is in the pudding. It's like we learned that in exercise physiology when we took that as juniors in undergrad. Right.
Well, and it's funny how it's like surprising, because it's really not. It's just it's no different. I mean, it's such a simple analogy, but it's no different than running, like basically having your, high performance vehicle with a quarter of a tank of gas left, but you got to go 100 miles, and that you're not going to be getting, you only have a couple gallons left and you're not getting 100 miles of the gallon, right? So you got to back off on the throttle, right? And you got to make sure that the truck or that car or whatever is basically going as slow as it possibly can to try and make it to the end. And it's the same thing with carbohydrate intake especially during endurance sports, because it's a linear correlation between the two. And if you don't have the substrates on board in order to, complete aerobic metabolism, you will have a higher propensity to go anaerobic. And when you do, that's when your breathing inflects and everything else. And you're like, like I said, you're looking at your heart rate and you're like, wow, I'm running, half as fast as I normally do, but I'm redlining. And it's, you're not, and it's so cool too that, to wrap it back around with hydration, that the glucose thing is also involved in the whole hydration status thing. That's not a coincidence. That's not a coincidence. That's actually what was perfectly designed, right? And so it's, if you think of the body as a baroreceptor control, everything that we talked about, if you think of the body as a perfectly designed machine, and this is what I always taught in my classes, is it's a perfectly designed machine, how would you do it, right? Here's some equations. It's really easy. It's really easy to figure it out. But the problem is we have so much misinformation out there, and we have a lot of misinformation from pretty high performing people, that people have lost trust in the actual fundamentals, which are too simple. Right? It really is. You don't have to over science the fact that if you just keep eating, you'll keep performing. And that's where, people want, they want you to make it complicated. And so they overcomplicate a very simple concept. It's like fuel for the sport, and you'll perform well in the sport. You'll perform to your best ability anyway. And if you train hard and you're not increasing, if your training's increasing and you're not increasing that caloric intake, then your performance will suffer. And you will reach a plateau in your performance, and you won't qualify for Boston or whatever you're trying to qualify for. And, it's funny you mentioned the athletes, and when you're talking about like triathlon, because when you go to these races, and I trained a couple of triathletes some years ago, and when you go to the races, you can't predict anybody's outcome by looking at their body. In fact, I've seen some people that you would say like they're not even going to finish, and they've placed well. And body composition is such an interesting thing in endurance sports, because fueling and genetics and training play such a massive role that you can't guess how someone's going to do by their body composition. You might in a marathon say, okay, these Kenyans are going to win, right? And they're going to be thin and lean and long and lean, right? And that's what we see, generally when we go to like Boston, right? You'll see some pretty lean, long, really well-developed athletes running across the line. But I've watched firemen in Boston, and they're in the top like 100 in work boots and they're like overalls running this thing. And they're big dudes. And you'd be like, these guys, you'd never guess that they'd actually even qualify for such an event. It's feeding, man. That's your number one. That's the only thing we can really control when it comes to our performance outside of training, right? The genetics, that those are going to be what they are, but fueling will always outperform genetics when you take two things that aren't equal, right? And that's the key. And right now we've got a big issue with carbohydrates because people are worried about glucose spikes, but hey, they're natural consequences of fueling.
I love it. One of my favorite athletes is, I think his name is Christian Blumenfeld, and he's won a couple of Olympic triathlons. And the dude is like a little bit chubby, but he's winning Olympic triathlons. And I'm like, you can't shortcut the training and the fueling. If that's just naturally how you look, and you kind of have like maybe like that physiological set point theory of like, you hold on this much weight, but you do the best you can with it, then that's your outcome. Serena Williams took crap for it for years, and you can't really, judge the fact that she's the undisputed GOAT. It's like, okay. And then
Absolutely.
you want to focus on aesthetics after you retire, fine, go on row and go on the GLP-1 agonist, whatever. But like while you were doing your sport, you have to fuel for that sport.
And you want to know what, that's the whole thing. If your training is well designed and you're doing it properly and you're fueling for the training, your body composition is going to fall where it needs to go. Right. And you'll naturally be selected in or out of the sport. And that's why, for me, bodybuilding became a sport for me after I raced dirt bikes, because I have a very, very, very voracious appetite. And I was a fat kid when I was younger. And so I had the body dysmorphia and everything went along with it. So when I got into bodybuilding, it was really neat because this is where, when my buddies who were always like really lean and looked really muscular, as we trained, I out-trained them over time because I could out-eat them. And as long as my training increased in intensity and my squats went up and everything went up and I kept eating, I got bigger and bigger and bigger. These guys stayed the same. They stayed at 196 pounds and I got like 225, 240. And I was competing at 154 at 18 years old. And by the time I was 26, I was competing in, at 225 pounds. And so that's a lot of lean mass. You got to eat a lot of food to get there. And so, overeating is a problem in itself, but I naturally got selected into that sport and I liked healthy food. I just liked a lot of it. And, it was easy for me to wake myself up at 3 a.m. and eat every night, in the middle of the night and that kind of stuff. It was just a thing I did. But you get naturally selected in it, it's just one of those things, right?
I think that message honestly needs to be broadcasted out more and more and more, because I don't know, like I've wrestled with that idea for so long that I have like two passions, and one of them is bodybuilding and the other one is like ultra marathon running. And those two things do not go well together. And I thought about why at 17 years old was I drawn to running my first marathon? And I'm like, because I did really well in it. That's why. And I did it on 3-year-old beat up Reebok Zigs that you could see my big toe hanging out of each shoe. Like I had nothing. I did not even wear compression shorts. I wore boxer shorts. I wore like a cut off cotton t-shirt, and my dad took me to the race and I was like throwing up before because I was so nervous, and I did really well on my first marathon. And he's like, hey, I think you have something here. And then when I started going throughout exercise science and 10 years of schooling and research, I went, I think I got something here. And with the gym, it's like I would go through like bulking seasons, like in the wintertime, and it's just, I hated it. Like I love lifting weights, but like I hated the food. I hated being full. And I was like, okay, that's fine. Let me focus on the one thing that I crave. And I crave 2 or 3 hours of cardio a day. I can't get enough of it.
And I love that. It's funny too, because when I'm right now I'm in really good cardiovascular shape for like endurance stuff. And I absolutely love feeling light and lean. And it's not for looks. I mean, I'm old now. I don't really give a shit about that so much. But the like feeling light and lean is really neat. When I went from being a 260 pound bodybuilder, losing I lost 100 pounds when I got diagnosed with kidney disease. I remember going to a water park with my kids and running up the stairs like 2 at a time with the rafts, that you go down the water slides on. And I came down, I said to my wife, I go, man, I miss this feeling. I miss this feeling of being light and lean and like easy to move. Right. And so, it's funny because I've always had this dichotomous relationship with bodybuilding. I love the discipline of it. I love the whole, like, it's you against you, that kind of shit. Right. But man, oh man, since I've got back into mountain biking again, I absolutely love the aspects of endurance sport that are like community. It's like a community-based thing. And when you do it, when you push yourself heavily with endurance sports, like I'm now hitting zone 5 for like 2 hours, which is crazy. Now I'm not in it for 2 hours, but I'm if I ride for 4 hours, I've got like intermittently in zone 5 for 2 hours. And I'm like, man, at my age, that's a real cool thing to do. And when you're done, that feeling of exhaustion after endurance exercise is such a mellow, for a guy with ADHD and all the shit that I've going on in my brain, it's so nice to be able to like come in from a sweaty, hard ride and be completely annihilated. You're just exhausted. And absolutely love it. I love all the stuff you've done. This is like, so cool at your age that you've got, all these races that you've done. Would you say like 30 some odd? How many friggin' marathons have you done? 80 some?
64 and 20 ultras. So it's like,
yeah, man,
over
like that's
80, and then the halves it's over somewhere over 100. I don't know.
that is like so cool, pushing the physiology like that. It's just awesome. And, and like you said, you found your niche by doing it. Funny enough, I have my wife's cousin. So he was like, his thing was to make it to Kona, and it was a feat, right? And it was a thing. And he finally got selected to go to Kona because he did so many Ironmans, right? And that's, I believe, how it worked. So his wife was in a triathlon with him, and she decides to finally do an Ironman qualifier, right? And she kills it. She absolutely kills it. And she's like, she has a totally different body composition than him, everything else, right? But she is actually like, it wasn't even like her dream to do it. And now she's like this amazing triathlete. And it's only because she tried it, right? And that's the only way with endurance sports, if you're good at it. With weightlifting and stuff, you can go into the gym, you can, progressive overload, do all the things and get stronger. But with endurance sports, it's one of those things where like you could have a group of 5 people go out and just start doing it. So they start walking, right? And they start speed walking. And the next minute they start jogging, and then all of a sudden one of them is running and the others are jogging, and then they break off from the group. And you'll see it all the time as these people all of a sudden realize that they have this genetic complement or whatever it may be, grit, whatever it may be, but they get drawn to endurance sport. But the problem with endurance sport is it's hard. Like it takes a lot of mental fortitude to say, I'm going to go out for, freaking 20K run or 5K run for the first time, 2K run. Right. And it's not until it kind of catches that people actually know whether they can do it or not. And that's what I love about endurance sports, is because you don't know until you actually get into it. You have to actually go out and do it. And it's cool.
And it becomes like this almost positive feedback loop, but in like the best possible way. And I did this whole video like a while ago, and it was just so much fun, like researching for it, where I was talking about both the acute and chronic implications of cardiovascular training. And I was talking about endorphins, and I was talking about endocannabinoids, both in the acute, but then long-term, the increases in BDNF. And I was like making the argument that I am a happier and more focused person than someone who does not otherwise cardio train, because like my BDNF levels chronically are higher. So like it's non-negotiable for me. I have to work out twice a day, and it's either cardio or cardio and weights. And I'm happier.
I love it. It's actually funny you say that, because I always knew when my wife came in for a run that she was going to be in like a really good mood, if you know what I mean. Like, and it's really funny because
I'm always ready to rock. Yeah.
yeah. And it was really funny because I would actually know it. Like I'd be like, oh, she's going out for a run. Like be in my office. I'd be, oh, there she goes. Sweet. In a couple
light
hours.
A candle ahead of time.
Yeah, exactly. Get the bath ready. Yeah. And it is that way, right? It is that way. And people feel a sense, we used to call it a sense of well-being, which is that overall sense of just like, things are great. And that comes from endurance training. And endurance training, I believe that the reason why it's such a, the acute effects and the chronic effects are so apparent is because it's a condition when you go into it, it's long term. Like you have to, like when you're in the acute sense, like it's a long time pushing the cardiovascular system, pushing the mitochondria, pushing your metabolism. And so the body is such a remarkable machine that everything upregulates that you just broke down. Right. And, you get the super compensation of glycogen, you get super compensation of any protein you're taking at creation, everything, that kind of stuff goes up. And now we're starting to cut into, like you said, like with BDNF and all of these brain factors. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing that everybody needs to do. And it's funny because we lose at your age, generally, that's when we lose the propensity to actually do the aerobic stuff. And I believe that's why a lot in the fitness industry, it's been like, well, why do cardio? It doesn't burn any calories. Well, it's way more than that. Like it's the calorie burn is what drives most of those systems that you just mentioned, right? It's the actual deficit that we put ourselves in. And yeah, it's remarkable stuff. And, if more people kind of dug into endurance training, I think we'd have a little happier world that's a little more healthier too, right? That's because we're pushing the metabolism.
Absolutely. Dwayne, this has been awesome. I want to be respectful of your time, and I got to head out soon. This has been,
yeah, I got to roll too. So,
but besides the fact that we spoke for like about an hour and a half before recording this, where can people find you and all the great work that you're putting out, all the great information?
Oh, thanks, man. So you can find me on the socials at DRDN Jackson, Dr. Dwayne Jackson. And if you Google me, you'll be able to find all kinds of stuff, lots of podcasts and all those things. And I'm releasing my Vitality Manifesto podcast mid-November. So there'll be lots of this kind of information coming out on there. And I'll definitely 100% have you on there, Mike, for sure.
I saw that on your website that you were like launching that soon. I was like, I can't wait to listen. So this is great.
It should be fun. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, man. We'll be in touch.